Oliver Sacks is a neuroscientist that blurred the lines between the literary world and the scientific world. He was born in England during World War II to two doctor parents, and he moved to the United States during medical school. And he toured around the states before eventually settling in California, where he began experimenting with the drug scene of the 60s. His first book he published was Migraine, which was published in 1970, and as a child he had experienced intense migraines, and his mother also had intense migraines, and so these migraines kind of inspired him to write this book where he covered everything related to migraines, including the auras and all the symptoms of migraine. His next book that he published, and the book that probably brought him the most fame, was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which was published in 1970 as well. And it details various case studies of patients with odd neurological disorders. And you guys will actually read or have read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is the first essay in the book, and it covers a case study as well. His next book that he published was Awakenings, which was in 1973. And Awakenings details some patients in a Bronx hospital that were infected with a rare bacterial disease in the 1920s, and they fell into a statue-like state where they were unable to move or really think. And no one was really sure if they were alive or conscious, but Dr. Sacks had done some research about Parkinson's and who had similar symptoms as these patients, and he read that L-Dopa, a drug, was helping these Parkinson's patients kind of reanimate themselves. And so he decided to try L-Dopa on these patients who had this bacterial disease, and it worked really well. They started coming back to life, and after 30 years they were able to think and feel again. But there were some negative side effects with the patients developing tics, similar to Tourette's, but overall it was a success and they came back to life essentially. After Awakenings, Dr. Sacks took a break from publishing for a little while, publishing smaller essays, but in the 2000s he started publishing again. He published Musicophilia in 2007, and as you may be able to tell, it talks about how music and the brain are related, and he grew up with a very musical background. His parents loved music, they would have music in the house, and music continues to be an important part of his life, and so it was only natural that Dr. Sacks would write about music and the brain and how the relationship is between them. His most recent book that he published was Hallucinations, and this was in 2011, and Hallucinations is a little different from his earlier works because it really gets into his personal stories, and I said before that he experimented with drugs in the 1960s, and there are actually chapters devoted to his experiences with drugs and the hallucinations he had with the drugs. And so here's a small clip detailing his rationale behind taking the drugs.
Although I can't claim very lofty motives in my drug taking, it did occur to me that there might be a bonus, that I might have the drugs might sensitize me to experiences of a sort my patients could have.
So as you can see, he had a rationale behind taking the drugs, and that these hallucinations he was having were similar to what his patients were having and similar to what migraine patients were having. But, I mean, it was the 60s, and he did just experiment to experiment. But this was published in 2011, and it's been a huge critical success. Recently, Dr. Sacks wrote an article for the New York Times explaining that he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he only had a couple months left to live. And this is an excerpt from the article, and it says, "I cannot pretend I am without fear, but my predominant feeling is one of gratitude. I have loved and been loved. I have been given much, and I have given something in return. I have read and traveled and thought and written." And in classic Dr. Sacks fashion, it's full of positivity, and he looks towards the future instead of dwelling on the past. And the article is really uplifting, because he obviously is upset that he only has a couple months left to live, but he says there's still time for joy, there's still time for silliness. And I think that's a really important thing to get away from Dr. Sacks, is that even though he writes about some scary symptoms, his essays are full of hope and happiness. In conclusion, Dr. Sacks blurred the lines between the literary world and the scientific world, and his books were truly revolutionary in the field of medical literature.